I really like the triad from the Des Lum Eisner and McNamara textbook, but I like this one a lot too. This is from another leading strategy textbook where I think it is useful as it takes some of those three things and breaks them up a little bit more specifically. I want to just briefly talk about the one at the bottom, balanced organizational controls. Very early in Des Lumpkin and Eisner is the idea of the balanced scorecard. And we didn't talk about it too much because there's just too much to talk about in this course. But I think it's worth mentioning that one of the things you do as a strategic leader is you set up that balanced scorecard, that idea of I'm not just looking at my past financial performance, but I'm looking at what do customers think of me. Are we constantly innovating and changing within the business? And are we growing people to assume greater positions of leadership and contribution within the company? I saw this little mantra when I was in the Air Force, and I wrote it down and I used it many times. And it's really simple: mission, people, fun. And so sometimes when I would be in my office early on the Monday mornings, because I like to get there before anybody else got there to organize my week and organize my thinking for the week, I would write down mission, people, fun. This is back when we had planner books. Now everything's online. And I would think, what am I doing this week for the mission? What am I doing this week for the people? What am I doing this week to make sure that we have fun in our job? And to the extent that I didn't see that we had enough, I would say, well, I need to reorder my week a little bit. I ask you to read a classic Harvard Business Review, I think it was originally published in 1972, article by Mintzberg, and is What Is It Strategic Leaders Really Do? This is one of those things I desperately wish the Air Force would have had me read before I got into strategic leadership positions. Often in this course, not this semester, but often I will have an ST assigned on this, and the ST question I'll say is, what do you think is different today than it was when Mintzberg wrote this article, which literally this article now is, it's impossible it is for me to believe. This is a 40-year-old article. And by the way, what's absolutely still the same? And I think most of the article is still relevant. Obviously, our information technology processes have improved. So if I'm going to give you a hint, if you didn't read the article, you're going to need to go back and read it because it's going to form a huge basis for one of the questions for the examination, potential questions for the examination. But I really think it's worth your time. It's a very light and delightful reading to see what is it people do, and this idea of the different roles I think is also very useful. I wanted to include this slide out of the textbook and relate it to your experience in BSG and as you get ready to do the chairman of the board. So you see the conventional thinking. Of course, we always have to denigrate the old way. It's very linear and set and rigid and all that other stuff versus the integrated thinking, which is now very smart and all that. Okay, let's get past the standard way we have to talk about things. Here's the thing I want you to think about with the integrative thinking, because I think strongly, I think that you have been doing integrative thinking in BSG, some of you better than others, frankly. And that is, you have to ask yourself, what are the right questions to ask? Because they're not set for you. And what are the choices? And how do I frame things? And even though you can say, well, BSG's got a bunch of computer decisions, yes, but there's tremendous latitude in how you put all that together. And I believe that this idea of integrated thinking really is so important to strategic leadership, because I don't want to say more so than ever now before, because I didn't live in all those ages past. Let's just say today it's a very complicated world with very complicated issues and problems. They're going to require complicated solutions. People want to say, well, it's simple. Rarely is it simple. Often it's complicated. That may lead you to a simple and elegant solution, but you get there through a complicated process. And this idea of integrated thinking is going to be central to that. I want to close this discussion with a story about ethics. I hope throughout the course of the semester, first of all, you felt like I've always dealt with you in an ethical manner. because ethics and integrity is extremely important to me. Uh, Students get tired of hearing about Enron, and I understand why. So I want to share with you an ethics story from my background. It's painful for me to admit this, but it's getting to be a dated story now. It's 10 years old, but I think it highlights some really key facets. And it's the story of an amazing lady, for at least a while amazing, named Darlene Druyan, and a gentleman named Michael Sears. Miss Druyan was, unfortunately, I do have to say this in the past tense, one of those true American success stories. She graduated from high school and went to work for the U.S. Air Force in an administrative position, earned her college degree along the way, transitioned to the management track, and through many years of noble service, became the senior acquisition executive in the Air Force. Now, if any of you understand what that really means, I'll be amazed. So let me put it to you this way. She was in charge of the entire organization that bought stuff in the Air Force. And about 1/3 of the Air Force budget goes to buying stuff like new airplanes and the like. Tremendously powerful position. Well, she retired from that position in 2002 and went to work for Boeing. Not surprising that a person would leave senior service in the Air Force and move to a defense contractor. She became the vice president of missile defense, which was a little interesting and necessary, ethically necessary, because you can't move directly into the areas you work. Well, the Air Force didn't own the missile defense program, so she was able to go into the missile defense program. One of the things about Miss Druyan is she was widely, if not respected, then feared. She was known as a very competent person, understood the details. Frankly, when it comes to the emotional intelligence, probably wasn't great in that vein, but her reputation, and I had many friends and colleagues that worked with her, was she was a straight arrow. She knew what she was doing, and she was trying to do what was best for the Air Force. So she goes to work for Boeing. A year later, Sears, who was the chief financial officer for Boeing and had been responsible for recruiting Miss Druyan, which was seen as a real prize hire because they thought she was going to have a lot of influence and help them win Air Force contracts in the future. They're both fired. And the reason they were fired is it was alleged that before Miss Druyan retired, she had conducted job negotiations with Boeing. Well, this is like impossible to believe because this is ethics 101. The idea that you don't talk about future jobs with potential employers while you're still the senior acquisition executive in the Air Force and making decisions on multi-billion-dollar contracts as to who gets A or B, that seems obvious. Everybody knows that. It's just one of the key tenets of the ethical rules, if you will, of federal service. So no way would she do that. She would be a fool. Why would she have to do that? She could just wait a few months and do that. Well, in the summer of 2004, she agreed in a plea bargain to plea bargain guilty that she had, in fact, conducted illegal job negotiations with, or inappropriate, I should say, not illegal, but inappropriate job negotiations with Boeing while she was still in the acquisition chair. Wow, this was stunning. And it was agreed that she was going to serve 6 months in a federal prison for her actions. So it kind of goes away, if you will. And then that fall, she came up for sentencing. And at sentencing, she was sentenced to 9 months. I'd never heard of that. How do you plead to 6 and then get 9? And what had happened was one of the requirements of her plea bargain is she had to cooperate with the Air Force as they were doing the investigation into what happened. And even though she admitted that she had had these inappropriate job negotiations, she kept failing lie detector tests until finally she came clean and said, well, I just didn't conduct early negotiations with them. Over the last several years, I tipped several major, and I mean major, multi-billion-dollar contracts to Boeing as a way to say, thank you for hiring my daughter, hiring my son-in-law, and getting ready to hire me. And I mean, this was stunning. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute, but this is literally unbelievable because the Air Force is an organization that prized integrity, demanded integrity, and yet this happened. Well, it cost her her reputation, 9 months in jail. I don't know this, but she probably lost her federal pension and is basically unemployable. So she lost everything. Boeing received a fine of $615 million. Not just for this case, there was another one, but it was mainly for this case. $615 million is a lot of change to have taken off the company's bottom line. But then both institutions really suffered. From the Air Force, even to today, 2013, the Air Force is having trouble every time they issue a major contract. It's often being contested by some of the losing bidders saying, well, the Air Force didn't do it right. And the Air Force today still has its acquisition processes under a lot of external scrutiny 10 years later. For Boeing, they went under a dark cloud and lost several contracts, to include they lost the contract to provide the aerial refueling, next generation aerial refueler for the Air Force, which was a huge contract. Now, they in fact contested that contract. The GAO upheld the contest. The Air Force recompeted it, and Boeing won it on recompete. But I can tell you how Boeing won it. They decided they could not afford to lose the contract, so they cut their price to the bone, and they won the contract, but they're not going to make much money on the deal because they cut their price so much. And this is just the way it is with ethics, and this is my message to you. It, in the long run, never pays. Not only does it not pay for the person that is violating the sense of integrity and ethics, doing unethical things, it often punishes relatively innocent organizations. There are a lot of innocent people in the Air Force and at Boeing that suffered for the actions of a few unethical people, which is to say, not only do you have to be ethical, you have to demand ethical behavior from your coworkers. And so, how do you do that? Well, it's a balancing act. You've perhaps been in an organization where it is so rule-bound, it's sickening. And the presence of all these rules almost make you want to violate them because you're a little insulted that they have all these simple rules. Well, that's one extreme. On the other extreme, you have organizations that it's very laissez-faire without any rules, and that's dangerous too. This is how Ms. Druyan was able to tip several major contracts to Boeing. There were some vacancies. Senior positions are always Senate confirmation, and you know in the political process how bogged down that gets. So there was a while when she was really the only dominant player, whereas normally a small cluster of people that make these kinds of decisions. And these weren't gross decisions in that people walked away and go, I can't believe that was completely the wrong people to win the bid. It was, well, I'm a little surprised Boeing won that, but well, okay, you know, it's close. It's always close. So you need some rules, but if you have too many, it actually corrodes the ethical environment. So it's a really difficult path to navigate to get that right. And then you have to be explicit about ethics as a culture. I would stand up, if I'm in a senior leadership, you always say, integrity is something I prize, we're going to act with integrity and the like, and then you have to demand it. Probably where you have to come down very hard on people. I'm very much a second chance, everybody makes mistakes kind of approach to life. When it comes to integrity, though, you have to be very careful about giving people second chances, not because that person doesn't deserve a second chance, but because people in the wide organization will misconstrue that and it will erode your ethical culture. And then you have to be scrupulous about ethics. And the reason I say that is you may do something that you admit that's kind of in the gray area, but I've looked at all the facts. I think this is okay. This is really okay. You've talked to the lawyer says it's okay, but it doesn't look good. Or people don't have all the facts, and it seems like it's clearly the wrong thing to do or an unethical thing to do by people who don't know the complete situation. Guess what? Next time they're posed with an ethical question, what they're going to remember is, well, the boss cut corners, and so am I. And even though maybe your situation was legitimate and it was an ethical decision, and their situation is not, and it's an unethical decision, they're going to feel very justified in taking that unethical shortcut. So you have to hold yourself to a very high standard. And I'm going to tell you, you have to decide that now. Because when you're in the heat of the moment, when things are really hot, there's going to be a lot of pressure on you to cut corners. You're going to feel like, oh, this horrible thing just happened in my organization. I don't want to come clean on this. You didn't do it. You just, as the boss, you don't want people to realize that you just damaged some worker down in the bowels of your organization, just damaged a $500,000 part, and we're going to have to write it off. Oh, surely, there's no good that comes out of reporting this. We're just going to kind of sweep it under the rug. Stop. You got to decide now. I'm not going to do that, because there's going to be a lot of temptation when you're in the heat of the moment to do it and to justify it. And it's going to be that little voice in the back of your head saying, nope, we said we're not going to do these things. That's going to keep you doing the right thing. And then as you design your reward systems, be very careful that your reward systems don't motivate people to unethical behavior. And of course, we see that with many salespeople. You take your car into service and they give you this 79-point inspection and they recommend $2,000 worth of work for your car. I'm not going to say that's unethical, but it's pretty close in my opinion, where they're recommending a lot of work that it's not like your car doesn't need it, but it really doesn't need it very much. So you have to not set your people up to be really tempted to be unethical. Let me finish this case of the Air Force and Boeing with this ethical question. Well, you're going to pay a $615 million fine if you're Boeing to the federal government. Guess what? Your accountants come to you and say, that fine is tax deductible. And if you think about what typical corporate income tax rates are, if you're looking at a fine of $615 million, which translates to a $615 million write-off, you're looking at about the difference between $100 and $200 million in saved income tax, or saved corporate tax. So they went to the CEO, who is the gentleman was relatively new at that point as the CEO. It's still the CEO of Boeing, a guy named McInerney. And they said, what do you think? We're going to take this write-off. Well, imagine that you're Mr. McInerney. Of course you're going to take the write-off. You're going to save the company. You're going to save your shareholders over $100 million. How can you not take the write-off? Right? McInerney said, we are not taking that write-off. We are not going to pad our bottom line, quote unquote, because of our ethical missteps. We're going to pay the fine, we're not going to take the deduction, and we're going to press forward. So you see, he made a clear stand to have an ethical, to try to put the company on stronger ethical terms. And oh, by the way, there's this not powerful senator, I say that very tongue-in-cheek, named John McCain, who was kind of mad at Boeing over this in several of the cases, that said to Mr. McInerney, boy, did you make the right move when this hit the press. Because if you'd have taken that write-off, I'd have hauled you guys in front of multiple hearings in the Senate, and it would not have been pretty. So ethics is really important. What I want you to do is, if you've not already, watch the series of other videos with Ann Mulcahy. Let me set the stage for them. I think they are wonderful, wonderful stories of strategic leadership. Ms. Mulcahy took over Xerox, and she recently retired as the CEO of Xerox, but she took it over when Xerox was facing bankruptcy, not imminently, but had had a tremendous downturn in performance. And oh, by the way, they're about to get hit by the recession of 2001 on top of the downturn in business. And if that's not bad enough, Miss Mulcahy knew that she was taking or stepping into the position without a lot of people's support. In fact, when Miss Mulcahy became the CEO, they had fired her predecessor, and her predecessor had a relatively short period of time in the job, and he was removed for poor performance. Um, well, Ms. Mulcahy had been considered in the CEO search earlier, and they had selected an outsider over her because they didn't feel like she was ready. Well, now it's only about 18 months later, and she is becoming the CEO, and a lot of people, it felt like she wasn't ready, both on the board and in the senior leadership of Xerox, still felt like she wasn't ready. So she's walking into a very tough situation with a lot of people thinking she's not up to it. And she proved them very, very wrong. She did a spectacular job of leading Xerox. And you're going to see this is her, if you will, valedictory lap where she talks about how she turned Xerox around. They're wonderful videos. I'm sure you're going to enjoy them, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy our guest speaker on Wednesday night. See you then.